Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas, everyone! It's getting really close, and I'm on my way right now out to check on the reindeer and the elves to make sure all the last-minute details are ready. Are you ready? I'm ready. Mrs. Claus thought I ought to share some stories with you. So while I'm on my way out to check on those reindeers and the elves, make sure they're doing their jobs, I thought I'd share a few stories with you. And the first story, since I'm going to be coming to Missouri this year, I know the kids in Missouri have been good this year, I'm going to share a story called The First Christmas in Missouri. A long time ago, over 2,000 years ago, the very first Christmas in Missouri, there was a rabbit, and he was hopping. And he hopped and he hopped. He'd been running all night long because he was being chased by a fox. And he hopped underneath an old hazelnut bush. And he sat there gathering his breath. And while he was sitting there, that fox was getting closer and closer. And so he began to hop again, and he hopped and he hopped and he hopped until he got to the crest of a bluff that overlooked the Missouri River. And when he got over that crest, he saw in the east a very bright star, a brighter star than he had ever seen before. Now, all of the animals and all of the birds sensed that something was different on this particular night. It wasn't long till the fox came up over the crest of that bluff, and he too saw that star in the east, that very bright star. And he went over and took his place beside the rabbit. One by one, the animals of the night made their way up to that bluff. And when they got there, the elk and the deer and the raccoon and the possum and the fisher and all of the animals, the skunk, when they came up over that cliff and they too saw that bright star in the east, they just sat down watching that very bright star. That star was so bright that night that it woke up all of the birds that were roosting in the trees, the eagles and the hawks, the crow. All of the songbirds were awakened by that very bright light. And they too saw that bright star and just sat there watching. They'd never seen a star that bright before. All night long the animals came and the birds came. And there were 3 old geese that were swimming on the river that night, that Missouri River. And they too saw that bright star in the east. And they began to flap their wings. And they began to fly. They circled around over all of the animals and the birds. And they started flying towards that star, those 3 geese. Because everyone knows the geese are the smartest and the wisest of all the birds. More and more animals came. More and more birds were awakened. Finally, an old buffalo came along. And the buffalo, too, made his way to the top of the crest of that bluff. And when he saw that star, he, too, made his way in a semicircle with the other animals, looking at that very bright star. It wasn't long before a hunter who had been following that buffalo for 3 days knew he was getting close to having food for his family. And when he came up over that rise and he saw that star, he took an arrow from his quiver, because the first thing he saw was that buffalo, and he knocked it to his bow. But when he saw that star, he released the tension on the bow and stuck the arrow back in the quiver. All night long, the birds and the animals watched that very bright star. And the next morning, when the sun came up, one by one, the animals left and went down into the valley below. And they say that day there was peace in the valley. The story is called The First Christmas in Missouri. But you know, Santa travels all over the world. You guys know that, right? And so I thought I would share some stories with you from all around the world. And the first story I want to share with you is called A Pinata for Pepita. Now, Pepita was a little girl about 10 years old, and she lived in Mexico. Her mother was from America, but her papa was from Mexico. And she lived with her parents in Mexico, but this Christmas, she had asked to go and spend Christmas with her grandmother. Now, her grandmother lived in a little small town in the very southern part of the United States called Willowville. And Willowville was a very small town. In fact, it didn't even have a place on the map. It was so small. But Pepita took the train from Mexico to Willowville. And when she got there, it was just a few days before Christmas. And all of the townspeople were getting ready for Christmas. It was a very friendly town. In fact, this town was so friendly that they would go out at night and they would put up a Christmas tree in the city square. And all of the people would bring their presents and food on Christmas Eve and put it underneath that tree. And the people would celebrate Christmas Eve all around that tree in that little town of Willowville. Well, grandmother, the 2 days before Christmas, she asked Pepita, she said, Pepita, what do you want for Christmas? And Pepita said, all I really want this year is a pinata. And grandmother, she didn't know what a pinata was. And she asked Pepita, what is a pinata? And Pepita said, oh, it's a wonderful thing. It's very colorful, and it's filled with candy and toys, and you break it. Grandmother didn't understand why you would break a Christmas present. So she took Pepita to the grocer, and the grocer said, you said it's very colorful? Oh, yes, it has many, many pretty colors, mucho colors. Because you see, Pepita, sometimes she spoke English and sometimes she spoke Spanish because she knew both languages from her mama and her daddy. Well, the grocer, he couldn't figure out what a piñata was either. He says, does it have candy in it? And she said, oh, yes, lots of candy. But he couldn't figure out what it was. So next, grandmother took her to the librarian, and the librarian said, oh, I know, because librarians know everything, right? And the librarian said, I've got this book. Let me show you. Does this look like a piñata? And she showed Pepita a picture of a pineapple. And Pepita says, no, it's not a pineapple, it's a piñata. Well, the librarian didn't know. So the next place they went was to the school. And the teacher said, well, what does this piñata, what does it have? And Pepita says, oh, it has lots of toys, lots of candy, and you break it. And the teacher, she had no idea. She'd never heard of a piñata either. Well, it was Christmas Eve, and no one in Willowville knew what a piñata was. Well, that very day on Christmas Eve, the train that rarely stopped in Willowville, it stopped that day, and the conductor took a big package off and took it into the train station. When the train manager looked at it, he saw it said to Pepita. Well, he knew exactly where Pepita was staying with her grandmother, and he took the box to Pepita. And when she opened the box, inside was a piñata. It was very colorful. It was very large. and it had the instructions on what to do with a piñata. Well, grandmother called all of the people of the town together, and she had them come to her house. And they moved all of the furniture off to one side of the room. And they hung the piñata from the ceiling. And then they took and they blindfolded first the grocer. And the grocer swung the stick, but he missed the piñata. He almost hit Pepita. Next, they gave the blindfold to the librarian. She swung several times, but she too missed the piñata. Then they gave it to the teacher, and the teacher swung so hard that she fell down. Finally, it was Pepita's turn, and Pepita took one hard swing, and she hit that piñata, and it burst wide open, and all of the people, the adults and the kids, all scrambled to get the candy and the toys. And that Christmas in Willowville, it was said it was the best Christmas ever because Pepita got her piñata. And that is the end of that story. Well, we're going to travel farther around the world. And this time, we're going to go to England. And England, as you know, they have kings and queens that rule in England. And there was a prince. And this prince went to his mother, the queen. And he said, "Mother," it was just a few days before Christmas. He said, "Mom, what would you like for Christmas?" And the queen, who had been very sick, she had been bedridden for months. She hadn't been able to get out of bed because she was so sick. She said, "Oh, my little prince, all I would like for Christmas are hugs and kisses." And the prince said, "Mother, you can get those all the time, but if you could have one thing in the whole world that you would like, what would it be?" "Ah," she said to the little prince, "if I could just have a little jar of rosemary. When I was a little girl, my grandmother always had a jar of rosemary sitting in her kitchen window. And in the spring, it would bloom these pretty blooms. I would really like to have a jar of rosemary." And so the prince left his mother's room, and he went to the royal servants, and he told them to go out to the king's greenhouse and bring him back a jar of rosemary. It's a beautiful little green plant. And the servants went out, and when they came back, they said, "Oh, Prince, please forgive us, but there is no rosemary. Rosemary grows in the spring. It blooms in the spring, and in the wintertime, it dies off. There is no rosemary in all of the king's greenhouses. Then go out into the kingdom and find me a jar of rosemary." And so the servants spread throughout the land. And they looked in every corner of the country. But they all came back and said, "Oh, Prince, we're so sorry, but we can't find rosemary anywhere." Well, now it was the day before Christmas, Christmas Eve. And one servant came back and he said, "Prince, I found an old woman who lives in this very town who has a jar of rosemary. Well, take a bag of silver and get it for me." And the servant left with a large bag full of silver coins. But he came back just a little while later, and he said, "The old woman, she will not sell that jar of rosemary. It's very important to her, and she won't sell it." "Well, then take her a bag of gold." And so the servant filled a large bag full of gold coins, and he took it back to where the old woman lived. And again, she said, "No, It was my grandmother's, and I've kept it all these years. I won't sell it." And so the servant returned, and he told the prince. And the prince said, "Well, take me, get the royal carriage, get the 6 white horses, and take me to the old woman's cottage." And the prince was taken by the royal carriage to the old woman's cottage. And when he went inside, he saw the old woman. He saw the jar of rosemary sitting on the kitchen windowsill. But he also noticed, laying in a bed, was a little boy about his age who was very sick and couldn't get out of bed. And the prince went over and he talked to the old woman. And she said, "No, I won't sell the jar of rosemary." And he went over and he began to talk to the little boy. And he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a very magic ball. There was no other ball like this in the whole kingdom. When you tossed it in the air or you bounced it on the floor, sparks would shoot out of it. It was gold and glittery all over the outside. And when you tossed it in the air, little bells would ring inside of it. The little boy that was sick was just mesmerized by this ball. He said, "Oh, if I only had one like it." And the prince said, "It's the only one in the whole kingdom. It's my very favorite toy. I always keep it in my pocket with me." Well, after a while, the prince left and he went back to the royal palace. And he thought, and he thought, and he thought, maybe I should go back and talk to the old woman one more time. And so this time he didn't have the servants take him. He made his way through the streets of that city until he got to the old woman's cottage. He knocked on the door and she invited him inside. And he said, "I've thought about this for a lot. And I decided your grandson, he likes this magic ball so much. I would be willing to trade the magic ball for the jar of rosemary." "Oh no," said the old woman. I just couldn't get rid of it. It belonged to my grandmother. It's very special to me." And so the young prince left. And the little boy that was laying in bed, he said, "Oh, grandmother, I sure would like to have that ball." And the grandmother got to thinking. And she put a shawl around her shoulders. And she took the jar of rosemary. And when she got to the king's palace, they didn't want to let her in. But the prince heard her voice and he invited her to come in. And when she went in, she had the jar of rosemary. And the prince reached into his pocket and they did the trade. The old woman took the ball and the prince took the jar of rosemary. Well, the next morning, it was Christmas morning, and because the queen was still sick, they carried her bed from her bedroom into the hall where all of the presents were piled up under the Christmas tree. There were so many presents because the queen had been so sick and everyone loved the queen, that there were presents everywhere. They were piled as high as the Christmas tree. There were even large wooden tables filled with presents. And right in the center of one of those tables sat that little jar of rosemary. The queen began to laugh. She was so happy, and the prince ran over, grabbed the jar of rosemary, took it to his mother, the queen. And he said, "Merry Christmas, Mother." And she gave him hugs and kisses. And they say, that was the best Christmas ever in the kingdom where there was a trade for a magic ball and a jar of rosemary. And that's the end of that story. Well, we're going to travel from England to France. And in France, there was a puppy. His name was Petey. And Petey got up on Christmas Eve morning, and his mama said, "Petey, what would you like for Christmas?" He said, "Oh, Mama, what I really want for Christmas is a boy for Christmas." And his mama said, "Well, Petey, have you been good?" "Well, I think I've been really good. I didn't chew on the shoe. Not even, well, maybe just a teeny weeny little bit. But I didn't play with the socks and hide the socks. Not even one. Well, maybe just one. Well, Petey, you have been pretty good this year. I'll go out after breakfast and I will see if I can find you a boy." And Petey went out. His mom, while Petey was outside playing, his mom left and she went to find a boy. It was late in the afternoon when Petey's mom came back and she said, "Petey, how would you like a nice rabbit with pink ears this year?" "No, I really want a boy." "Well, how would you like a little baby chick to play with?" "No, I really want a boy." And no matter what Petey's mom asked, the answer was always the same. "No, Mama, I want a boy." Well, Petey's mom had looked all day long from one end of the town to the other, and she had found no boys that didn't have puppies. And so she said, "Well, maybe, Petey, it's getting kind of late in the afternoon, but if you want to, it's Christmas Eve, maybe you can go out and maybe you can find a boy." And so Petey left. He was excited. And he ran down the street, and then the next street, and then he saw it. There was a boy who was running a foot race with his English bulldog. And Petey, from across the street, he yelled, "Mr. Bulldog, Mr. Bulldog, would you like to give up your boy?" "I certainly would not." And Petey thought, well, maybe I didn't want to run with a boy anyway. It sounds like hard work. And besides, he sounded pretty mean. Well, Petey went on, up and down the streets, and then he saw it. A French poodle. And the French poodle was walking along beside his boy, carrying a package in his mouth, very daintily. And Petey decided he would ask in a little quieter voice this time. Maybe the poodle would be willing to give up his boy. "Oh, Mr. Poodle, would you like to give up your boy? I'd like to have a boy for Christmas." "I certainly would not. Be on your way." And Petey thought, well, maybe carrying a package in your mouth wouldn't be that much fun anyway. And Petey ran and he ran. He went down streets, up streets, down through alleys. And then he saw it. He saw a boy with a German shepherd, and they were playing catch with a ball. "Oh, Mr. Shepherd, would you like to give up your boy? I really want a boy for Christmas." "I certainly would not," said the German shepherd. "Begone. Do not bother me anymore. I'm having too much fun with my master." And Petey ran on down the road. He was getting tired. His feet hurt. And then he saw right at the edge of town was a house that was all lit up. And as he ran towards that house, thinking maybe there was a boy at that house, as he got closer, he saw a little boy sitting on the front steps of that porch. And Petey ran as fast as he could, and he jumped right in the boy's arms. And he licked the boy right on his face, giving him all kinds of wet kisses. "Where did you come from?" the little boy said. "You're such a cute puppy. I'd like to keep you." Well, about that time, Petey looked up and he saw a sign over the door that said Boys Orphanage. And about that time, a woman came to the door and said, "Jimmy, it's time to come inside. We're getting ready to do Christmas carols around the Christmas tree." And Jimmy looked down at the puppy and he said, "Well, can I bring my friend inside with me? He gives me really good kisses." And the woman said, "I think that would be fine. Bring him in and we'll give him some food and some water." And so Jimmy took him inside. And when he got inside, there were 49 other boys all around that Christmas tree. And some of them started saying, "Can I get him the food? And can I get him the water?" And pretty soon, there were 50 boys that were getting wet kisses from Petey. And the boys said, "Can we keep the puppy?" And the woman said, "I don't see why not. It would be a good Christmas present." And indeed it was. And the next day the woman went and she found Petey's mom, and Petey's mom agreed to let Petey stay with the boys at the orphanage. So Petey not only got one boy for Christmas, he got 50 boys for Christmas. And that's the story of the puppy who wanted a boy. We're going to travel now from France to Italy. It's not very far, especially when you're riding in a sleigh with reindeers. And this story is about an old woman named La Befana. And La Befana, nobody knew how old she was. She lived in a village way up on top of a hill. And she would bake cookies every day. And people from the village in the valley below, they would smell the cookies cooking. And they would say, "Oh, that's old Befana. She's making her cookies today." Well, Befana, every day, she would take her broom and she would sweep her floors. And then she would take her dust rags and she would dust all of her furniture. And after she baked her cookies, she would do the dishes. And she did this every day. Well, it was almost Christmas Eve. And La Befana, she had swept her floor. She had dusted her furniture. She had done the dishes. She was just getting ready to go to bed when a knock came on the door. And when that knock came on the door, La Befana went over, she opened the door, and there stood 3 men, all dressed in royal robes. They were 3 kings. And they told La Befana they were on their way to find this special child who was to be born on Christmas Eve. And indeed, he had been born. And they were going to bring him presents. But it was getting close to morning. And they had rode all night watching that very bright star in the east. And so La Befana brought them inside. She offered to give them cookies and milk, and they ate the cookies and drank the milk. And she said, "You can go sleep in my bed if you want to, because I've got to sweep my floors. I've got to dust the furniture. I've got to bake cookies and wash the dishes." And the 3 kings slept all that day. They got up that night, and just as they were getting ready to leave, La Befana said, Here's some cookies and milk. They said, "Oh, no, we don't have time. We've got to be on our way. We've got to follow that very bright star." And so the 3 kings left. But before they left, they said, "Befana, why don't you come with us? And you too, bring some of your cookies. I'm sure those people would like some cookies." "Oh, no, I couldn't possibly do that. I've got to sweep my floor. I've got to dust the furniture. I've got to bake cookies. And I've got to do the dishes." And so the 3 kings left. And Befana, she swept the floor. She dusted the furniture. She'd already baked cookies that day, so she didn't bake anymore. But she did her dishes, and then she went to bed. She hadn't been in bed very long when she thought to herself, what do kings know about taking presents to a baby? Now you see, Bafana, she had been married many, many years ago, and all of her children were grown, but she had stored all of the toys from her children in a big trunk. And she went over and she got into that trunk and she began putting toys in that bag. And then she left. She knew she wouldn't be able to catch up with those three kings because they were riding on camels and she had to walk. So at every house that she came to, she would look in the window and she would say, is this the special child? Is this the special child? Is this the special child? And she didn't know for sure. So she would go inside and she would leave them a cookie on their nightstand and a little toy under their bed. And the next morning when they got up, they would see the cookie and the present that Bafana had left for them. For years, La Bafana searched for that child, that special child. Now, she never did find him. But they say to this day, if you go to Italy on January the 5th and you go to bed that night, the next morning on January 6th when you get up, there will be a cookie and a toy under your bed. The story is called La Bafana. That's the end of that story. Well, I think I've probably got time to tell you maybe one last story. And this story comes from Germany, and it's called Little Blue Dishes. There was a husband and his wife, and they lived in a small cottage. The husband was a woodcutter, and they were very poor. And it was Christmas time. Now, they had 3 children. Hans was the oldest, Peter was second, and Gretchen was the youngest little girl. And Christmas Eve came, and all of the children went down into the town to the toy shop to look at the toys, to see what they would possibly like for Christmas. Now, the woodcutter and his wife, like I said, they were very poor, and they had told the children they weren't going to get very much for Christmas this year. So when they went down, Peter looked at all of the cars. He liked the cars. Hans looked at the soccer balls, the footballs. That's what he would like for Christmas. And Gretchen saw this little set of little blue dishes in a box. And so when they went back home, Hans went out to play football or soccer with his friends. And Peter asked Gretchen, he said, well, what would you like for Christmas of everything that we saw? She said, oh, I would love that little box of blue dishes. And they talked about Christmas and what it was going to be like this year. And finally, Gretchen was tired and she went to bed. Peter went to his little bank and he took out the only coin that was in it, 1 penny. And he went back to the toy store and he asked the man, what can I get for 1 penny? And the man that had the toy store, he said, the only thing I have is a heart with a picture painted on it, a candy heart. Oh, what I really wanted was that box of little blue dishes. And the toy store owner said, well, that costs 10 cents. And so Peter took the little candy heart, took it home, and dropped it in Gretchen's stocking. And then Peter went to bed. Well, Hans had played soccer until there was no more light to play. And when he came home, he was hungry. And he noticed something in Gretchen's stocking. And he looked inside, and there was that candy heart. And he thought, maybe if I just take a lick off the back side of it, she won't notice. And before long, Hans had ate the entire candy heart. He went to his little bank, and he pulled out 10 pennies. And he went to the toy store. The owner was just about to close for the night when Hans said, "What can I buy for 10 pennies?" And the toy store owner said, "Well, almost all my toys are gone, but I do have this little box with blue dishes." Hans says, "I'll take it." And he went and he put it in Gretchen's stocking. And the next morning when they got up and they went and they opened their stockings, Gretchen was surprised when she pulled out the box with the little blue dishes. But Peter was even more surprised. What had happened to the candy heart? But that year, Gretchen had a very good Christmas because she got her box with the little blue dishes. Well, it's time for me to go. I got to go check on those reindeers. I got to make sure Rudolph's getting them all ready. And the elves, they've been working really hard this year. And if you've been really good, we'll see you on Christmas Eve. But you got to go to bed when Mom and Dad says to, so I can come and do my job. Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas, everyone!